It's back to school today for students at the Ottawa Carleton District School Board. So with all students in the city now back in the classroom, at least most of them, there are a number of concerns for parents about how a COVID-19 case or outbreak could impact their job. Employment lawyer Alex Lucifero joins us now to address some of those concerns. So I guess, Alex, let's start with this. Can an employer fire someone if they have to remain at home because of childcare reasons?
Well, the short answer, Matt, is no, absolutely they cannot. Family status, so the requirement of a parent to care for a child is a protected ground under our human rights legislation in Ontario. And so if an employee requires accommodation in the form of having to take some time off to care for their sick child, an employer cannot punish an employee for having to do that. That is potentially discrimination under that human rights legislation. So again, the short answer is no, absolutely not.
Right, but there are still, I'm sure, right, it's few, as we talk about too, some of this law is new when it comes to the pandemic and whatnot. So let's get into an outbreak at the, what can an employee do if there's an outbreak at their child's school and when it comes to their work and their job?
Sure. Well, listen, communication is key here. It's key to any employment relationship between an employer and employee, Matt. So really what an employee should be doing there is communicating with their employer with respect to any requirements they might have to stay home, to care for their children, or to isolate potentially because their child has been exposed to COVID-19 in the workplace. So step number one is communicating that requirement to the employer. Potentially providing some evidence to the employer in that respect, although this is not the Spanish Inquisition. You don't have to provide, a massive level of documentation or information. And then step number two in response is that, again, the employer does need to accommodate, does need to be flexible in allowing that employee to stay home and care for that sick child.
Okay, and again, as we talk about too, a lot of, and we know a lot of employers have been flexible with some of these arrangements, and certainly, again, it's brought a lot more into the workforce. I'm curious too, if I'm a parent as well, does my employer have to pay me if I'm unable to return to work because of childcare obligations, or where does that stand?
Excellent question. So again, an employer does need to accommodate, but they do not need to pay you necessarily to take that time off. So they should allow an employee to stay home if they have to care for a child and to give them that time off. But that time off does not need to be paid. That is where the buck stops. Now, if an employee has vacation days they could potentially access, or even sick days they can potentially access, in that kind of situation, by all means go ahead, but the employer is not obligated to pay.
And I'm just curious, Alex, too, people been coming to you with these questions and these concerns too, and I'm sure you're going to be a little bit more busy as we kind of navigate. It's still, again, we're into the fall of a year and a half of this, but still been tough for some, I'm sure.
We certainly have, and we've been navigating these particular questions, especially through the lockdown periods. And with a fourth wave potentially on the way, or already on the way, we might be faced with another one of those situations where employees are required to stay home to care for their children. And it certainly creates some friction between employers and employees.
Yeah, can imagine. Alex Lucifero, employment lawyer, we always appreciate your insight. Thank you for this, sir.
Thanks for having me, Matt.